Okay, we're going to pick up with part two of the Cold War. We left off with talking about the division in Germany, how Germany was divided in East and West. And of course, we've gone into the discussion about the Soviet Union and how they are controlling most of the Eastern European nations and how those nations have become communist. Now we're going to look at the period sort of into the 1950s. Joseph Stalin had been in control of the Soviet Union since the 1920s. And eventually, Joseph Stalin would die, and he dies in 1953. And he's going to be replaced by this man that you see here in the bottom corner here, is going to be Nikita Khrushchev. Nikita Khrushchev is going to take over for Joseph Stalin. Khrushchev has a different view or a different idea of how he would like for the Soviet Union to be perceived. This idea was known as de-Stalinization. He wanted to take Russia or the Soviet Union away from being portrayed as being very harsh, and he thought he needed to loosen the government up a little bit and allow industry to have a little more independence. Whereas under Stalin, of course, they were ruled with a very tight fist. He also ended the purges and imprisonment of any of the Soviet Union's opponents, which Stalin had engaged in and had many people executed during his reign. And of course, Khrushchev is going to try to back away from some of those things. Khrushchev is also going to put more emphasis on consumer goods. He's going to put more emphasis on agriculture. And he wanted the Soviet Union to be portrayed in a more friendlier way. So Khrushchev, again, tries to change the way the Soviet Union is being perceived. And for a little while, he accomplishes that. In the early 1960s, though, we get a crisis that's going to occur between the Soviet Union and the United States. And this is going to be the Cuban Missile Crisis. And what you're going to see happen is Cuba had once been a big time ally of the United States. In fact, if you went to Cuba during the 1930s and 1940s and the early 1950s, Cuba was like a resort area. It had casinos, and a lot of money from the U.S. was being pumped into Cuba's economy. But the problem was that most people in Cuba viewed the government as being corrupt and viewed the government as taking advantage of the Cuban people. And so a revolution occurs. And in this revolution, there's going to be a group of communist soldiers that are going to be led by a man named Fidel Castro, who's going to overthrow the Cuban government and eventually throw the United States out. The United States realizes that they need Cuba and that Cuba could be a big help, but they didn't want communism at their back door. And so the United States plans an invasion of Cuba. This invasion is known as the Bay of Pigs. The only problem with this invasion was that it wasn't well funded and well backed. It was mainly made up of Cubans who had exiled to the United States, as well as some CIA operatives to try to invade Cuba. Castro got word of this invasion, and so when this invasion happens, pretty much Castro's waiting on these soldiers as they try to storm the beaches in Cuba, and the Bay of Pigs is a failure. The president during that time was John F. Kennedy, and of course, it's sort of a black eye for John F. Kennedy in the beginning of his administration in the 1960s. Again, Fidel Castro is going to side with the communists, and with the Soviet Union being communist as well, they saw this as an opportunity to get a foothold in the Western Hemisphere. And so they decided to put nuclear missiles in Cuba. And this is going to lead to this crisis. Um, a lot of things are going to happen during this period. It went on for about 13 days. Kennedy, who's our president at that time, John F. Kennedy, and Nikita Khrushchev are sort of locked in this tug of war on how they're going to get these missiles out of Cuba. Kennedy wants them out. Khrushchev wants to keep them in. Eventually, they compromise when Kennedy agrees to remove missiles from Turkey, and Khrushchev then again decides that if they do that, then they could remove the missiles from Cuba. So eventually, it comes to an end. One of the other things that's not mentioned in this slide was that the United States issued a blockade around Cuba, and we come really close to the brink of war when a Soviet ship carrying nuclear warheads arrives just outside the blockade, and it's sort of like daring the United States to do something. And but eventually, the Soviets back down. Khrushchev orders the ship to turn around, and this crisis is avoided. So, Cuban Missile Crisis, very tense time in the United States, closest we've probably ever been to war with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. So, again, closest time period that we've ever had of actually fighting a war against the Soviet Union. The U.S. would continue an embargo on Cuba because of their communist ties. And if you didn't know this, Cuba is only 50 miles off the coast of Florida. And of course, the United States did not want this communist country on its doorstep. And we put a lot of pressure, economic pressure. We didn't sell them a lot of things. So, Cuba, for a very, very long time, their economy is going to struggle. And just recently, we've opened up some diplomatic relations with Cuba after Fidel Castro's death. The other event during the Cold War that was a major event was what was going on in Southeast Asia. One of the ideas about Southeast Asia was that if communism got a foothold in Southeast Asia, that all the other countries in Southeast Asia would become communist as well. So again, the domino theory was what a lot of people thought about Southeast Asia. The other problem that we had in Southeast Asia was China. And we're going to go into more detail about China later on, but China is going to emerge after World War II as a communist nation led by a guy named Mao Zedong. This happens in 1949. Mao Zedong is going to take over, and he's going to force the Chinese nationalists out of China, and they're actually going to flee to the island just off the coast of China, which is known as Formosa, and eventually it changes its name to Taiwan. But that's where the Chinese nationalists fled to. The communists are going to take over in China, and China is going to cut all ties to the West, and it's going to ally itself with the Soviet Union during this period. Again, China is going to start to support communist activities in Southeast Asia, and we're going to talk about a couple of those places in just a minute. The policy of the United States during this period was the policy of containment to stop the spread of communism wherever it happens, and in this case, in Southeast Asia. Our first test of this containment idea, our containment policy, was in Korea. After World War II, remember the Japanese had controlled most of China and Korea during this period, but after World War II, Korea would be divided much like Germany, and it's going to be split into two parts, with the northern portion being controlled by the communists and the southern portion being controlled by the Allies after the war. But eventually, they're going to split the country of Korea, which is going to establish a North and South Korea. The North, again, occupied by the communists who were backed by the Soviets and the Chinese. The South being supported by the United States, and it's still like that even to this day. The North is going to invade the South in 1950, and the U.S. would send forces to try to protect the South under the Truman Doctrine. And again, the Korean War starts when the North invades in 1950. This war would go on for 3 years. It would end in a stalemate, and North and South Korea remain split even to this day. And that, again, is why we have so many problems even right now. So, again, make sure you understand the Korean War. You can do some more research about it. Make sure you know where Korea is split. It's split at the 38th parallel, and that remains that way even to this day. The other place that there's going to be a tension during the Cold War is going to be Vietnam. After World War II, Vietnam was, of course, also split. France is going to be in control of the southern portion of Vietnam, whereas the northern portion was going to be under a group known as the Viet Minh, under the leadership of a guy named Ho Chi Minh. And this is going to create a conflict between North and South, and they're going to fight for control over Vietnam. Eventually, France is going to withdraw, and there's going to be a peace agreement. Again, Cold War politics is going to cause Vietnam to be divided, the North being communist, the South being democratic, but authoritarian. Authoritarian means you sort of got one guy that's really calling the shots. So the North and the South are created out of these Cold War politics and out of this peace agreement in the 1950s. The U.S., again, trying to stop the spread of communism, was worried about South Vietnam and began to send aid to South Vietnam to protect them from the communists in the North. But the problem was that the government in South Vietnam was very elitist, and it was really unpopular among a lot of the South Vietnamese, and the United States tried to prop that government up a few different times before a lot of this stuff starts taking place. During that period, there's going to be groups of people living in South Vietnam that are going to support the ideas of the North, and this group was known as the Viet Cong. And the Viet Cong are going to be in South Vietnam, and they're going to be harassing the government and helping out the North in trying to plan an invasion. The Viet Minh declares war on South Vietnam during the 1960s. And once this happens, the United States would send in 500,000 troops in 1965, and they would continue sending troops up until 1972. This war is often viewed as a stalemate. Neither side really could claim victory, but if you had to pick a victor, it would have been the North, because eventually the United States and its allies are going to withdraw from Vietnam. 90,000 Americans were killed during this period of fighting in Vietnam before Vietnam is eventually unified and taken over by the North Vietnamese, and it becomes the country of Vietnam. A lot of people during the war in America were divided over whether we should be there or not. They didn't understand it. They didn't understand the fight against communism. They didn't understand why we had to be in Vietnam. The Vietnamese had never done anything to us. There were protests and all sorts of things that went on during this period. And of course, this really did not help the war cause during this period. The U.S. would eventually withdraw from Vietnam in 1973, and the last U.S. soldiers finally left Vietnam, I think around 1975 or 1974. But the U.S. officially begins its withdrawal around 1973. The peace agreement that sort of seals the deal on Vietnam is called the Paris Peace Accords. Once this is over with, South Vietnam would fall to the communists, and the country of Vietnam would be established. Relations would improve with the liberalization of Vietnam in the 1980s, and the communism would eventually fade in Vietnam. Okay, that's going to do it for this part 2. We will pick up with a part 3 next week to sort of wrap up the Cold War. Then we're going to look at some individual places, some things that went on in China. We'll talk more about the Korean War. We'll talk a little bit more about Vietnam before we finish up and get ready for our next test. Okay, catch you guys on the next one.